The Tao Te Ching is traditionally ascribed to a shadowy figure, Laozi. The word Laozi isn't even a name. It means the old master. Hagiographically, he's represented as an older contemporary of Confucius. However, there's no very clear evidence that he ever actually existed, and there's no clear sense of who actually wrote the Tao Te Ching and over what period it was actually written. It's a very shadowy text written by a very shadowy author or collection of authors. Most contemporary scholarship takes it that the Tao Te Ching is actually a compilation of bits and pieces and sayings and chapters from a variety of earlier sources. There seem to have been several early recensions of the text, but the one that we know and love was solidified somewhere around the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era. It comprises 81 chapters of varying length. Some are only a few lines long, some a whole page long, and they're grouped into 2 books. The first book begins with the word Tao, which means way. The second book begins with the word Day, which, as we've seen, means virtue. So Tao Te Ching means really the book whose first volume begins with the word Tao and whose second volume begins with the word Day. There's actually also a version in which the 2 books are reversed, and what we normally know as Book 2 comes first, and that one, not surprisingly, is called the Day Tao Ching, but we'll be looking at the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching turns out to be the most frequently translated book in the world. Almost everybody who learns to read and write classical Chinese seems to translate the Tao Te Ching. There are literally hundreds of them. One of the things that we're going to see that's so fascinating is the translations of this text differ vastly. And that's because the text itself is very open-ended, very complex, and is susceptible to many different interpretations. It has been read, for instance, as primarily a religious text. It's been read as a philosophical text. It's been read as a political text. And it's even been read as a text on military strategy. Mao Zedong, for instance, is said to have relied heavily on the Tao Te Ching in planning the Long March during the Chinese Revolution. Taoism is very much a living tradition in China. There are Taoist monks, Taoist temples, Taoist philosophers working within the tradition. As we're going to see, it is antagonistic to Confucianism. The Taoists really took themselves as critics of a Confucian order. On the other hand, with the Confucian tradition, Taoism shares a certain preoccupation with this idea of wu wei, sometimes translated as inaction, but as I've suggested, effortless action is a much better translation. Wu wei in this sense can be thought of, as I keep emphasizing, as virtuosity, the kind of fluidity in action, fluidity in life that comes from long practice and accustoming oneself to acting in a particular way. But what we're going to see that's so much fun is that the Taoists have a completely opposite understanding of the cultivation of wu wei, of virtuosity. Whereas for the Confucians, this is a positive thing, building up more and more propriety, better and better habits, more and more understanding of the classics and of how to behave. For the Taoists, it's entirely negative, cutting away, shaving away, returning to a natural state, getting rid of accretions. And there's an opposite understanding of the relationship between culture and nature. For the Taoists, culture inhibits our naturalness. Whereas for the Confucians, as we've seen, it's part of our nature to be cultured and to become cultured. And we will also see an opposite understanding of the role of language and conventions. For the Confucians, these are cultivating, civilizing factors that make us better. For the Taoists, they just get in the way. Let's pay attention to this crucial word Tao right now, and pay attention to its root. The meaning of the word Tao, most simply, is a way. So it can mean a way to go, that is, the way to get from New York to Los Angeles. It can mean a path. So I could talk about a Tao as being a path through a forest or a particular road or route. It could be a way of doing things. My particular way of dancing, or my particular way of composing a lecture, or my particular way of walking. So a Tao can be a way that we do things, and it can also be then a way of life. So a Tao can be the way I lead my life. But interestingly, a Tao can also mean a discourse, a speech, a discussion, or it can mean a text. A Tao can be a poem or a paragraph or a sentence. In this sense, it can be a way of thinking or a way of talking. And finally, it can also refer to the fundamental nature of reality. As we might put it, the way things are, the way the universe exists. And so Tao can have all of these meanings. And because of that, trying to interpret Taoism in the Tao Te Ching becomes a very complicated matter. The second word that we have to worry about is this word day that we've encountered in the Confucian context, meaning virtue. So it can mean moral virtue, but it can also mean nature, as in the nature of things. It can mean excellence, it can mean purity, it can mean power, and it can mean light. And so it can contrast with darkness. So day has all of these different meanings as well. So when we talk about the Tao Te Ching, all of a sudden the meanings of these words become very complex and very fluid. So in the Tao Te Ching, what is the Tao a Tao of? Well, primarily it's a Tao of life, a way to live. And the way of life that it is a life that's lived in harmony with the universe. For that reason, it's also the Tao of the universe, the fundamental nature of things. Because the central insight of Taoism is that the right way to live is in harmony with the way the universe itself is. But since human life is so concerned with talking and thinking and drawing distinctions, it's also a Tao of talk and a Tao of thought. How should we think about things? How should we describe what we're doing? The Tao, in this sense, is all of these things. The nature of the universe, the way we should live, the way we should think about the nature of the universe, and how to live. The Taoist account of life is distinctive in several ways. One I've already mentioned. There's a paring away, the Taoists argue, not a development. The Confucians argue that we develop more and more culture and become better. The Taoists that we become better the more of our culture we strip away and return to nature. The emphasis then is on nature, not culture. A second idea in Taoism that's so important is that there's always an emphasis on the background, not the foreground. We're always going to find Taoists emphasizing the empty space as opposed to the positive things that occupy that space. The goal is a goal not of creating a kind of spontaneity, but of recovering an effortless spontaneity that we have in us from birth. There is also always a deep suspicion of language and thought in Taoism, and an attempt to return to a primordial mode of thinking that is prior to and more fundamental than discursive thought. As we look at chapter 1, we're going to encounter a few major themes. One is a critique of the Confucian idea that we need to get our language just right. And that's going to occur through a kind of emphasis on the variability and relativity of meaning. An introduction of the idea that there has to be a primordial, non-discursive ground of experience that makes signs, thought, language, and action possible. A noticing of a special role of desire in generating experience, and this emphasis on the negative space as a ground for the positive. What I'd like to do with you now is to look at Book 1 and to look at it by looking at 3 different translations of Book 1 to, first of all, just give you a sense of the manifold ways in which this text is read, but